And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. This is the .NET Doc Show. As doctors of .NET, we at least attempt to prescribe healthy choices in .NET, low in carbs, very low cholesterol levels. Really what we're aiming for here. I'm your host, Scott Addy, with co-hosts Luis Quintanilla and Myra Wenzel. I'd like to welcome today's guest, Steve Smith, better known as R. Dallas on the interwebs. If you've done .NET development for, let's say, even a couple of months, Steve's name is probably one that you've heard of before. Steve also joined us in the early days of the show to talk about the eSample or eShop sample web app. If you read any of the ebooks in the .NET Architecture Center on DOS, you've also probably seen Steve's name. Welcome to the show, Steve. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Scott. Thanks. Glad to be here on the show. Like you said, I do a lot of stuff with .NET and produce a bit of content around it. I've got a few NuGet packages, open source things on GitHub as well. I do training on Pluralsight. I have a small consulting company. We try and help teams do better work faster. So if people are looking for that, they can always hit me up. But otherwise, I've just really been enjoying working with .NET for about 20 years now. It's been a good ride, and the new versions with .NET Core and .NET 5 are really awesome and a lot of fun to work with. So that's it for me.
Very cool. With that, why don't we roll into the checkup doc segment?
Let's do it.
All right, I'm very excited to share today's doc. So what you're seeing here on my screen is a doc that is all about a feature in ASP.NET Core known as route to code. This is something, believe it or not, it's fairly new. A lot of people still haven't heard of it, hence the reason why I'm showcasing it today. So what is route to code? That's probably your first question. This is something that puts you closer to the metal of an HTTP request, and I say metal in air quotes. Route to code relies on the endpoint routing feature that was introduced in version 3.0 of ASP.NET Core. What this is a way to map HTTP endpoints using the use endpoints method calls. You've probably seen these in your startup CS file in 3.0 and newer versions of ASP.NET Core. So as I mentioned, this isn't Web API or HTTP API, RESTful API, whatever term you want to use there. It's an alternative typically used for simpler operations. So what does this thing support? What does it not support? Those might be your next questions. Any kind of auth, authentication, authorization, those are supported. The difference here between Web API is those auth scenarios are supported through extension methods instead of the attributes that you may be accustomed to seeing. There's a section in this doc, if you look at the in this article legend over here, that I want to direct people to. Notable missing features compared to Web API. If this sounds appealing to you, look here first to see what the limitations are. What are the things that are missing? The big one is model binding. So if you're doing any kind of validation through like attributes or say a Fluent API, you might run into problems there with that being supported. Open API Swagger. So if you're doing any kind of testing pages that are being generated for your API, again, it falls short in that area. Content negotiation, constructor injection, not supported. And then finally, the problem details response. So Web API is capable of returning this type of response by calling the problem convenience method in that controller base class. Again, we don't have that here in route to code. Wanted to flip over and show a quick sample of how you might use route to code in the real world. I actually used this very recently in a GitHub project I was working on where, in this case, in my startup CS file, I was just mapping an HTTP GET endpoint such that if I were to, in my app, append /config to the URL, it would execute this code that you see highlighted. All that it's really doing is writing out to the screen the configuration providers that I have registered and the values that it's retrieving with those providers. Now, Luis, if I recall in the pre-show talk, you had mentioned that route to code is something you've used in the real world. Is that something you wanted to share with us, like what you've done with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the use cases where this comes in and becomes really handy is for deploying machine learning models. So typically the way that you would deploy a machine learning model, and folks who may have worked with Python, perhaps they've worked with Flask, are familiar with, is the way that you go about deploying these models typically is you set up a web server, and it has a single endpoint usually that exposes your machine learning model for making predictions over HTTP. Now, from a .NET standpoint, right, like this allows you to just set up that single endpoint with minimal configuration. And again, because all you need is literally just one endpoint, it makes it really quick and really easy to get your models into production. Again, there's some fallbacks that you can, or some things that are going to be missing, right, such as discoverability, model binding, and things like that, which are noted here in this doc. But I think what Steve's going to be showing us today kind of makes some of those things go away and makes it really easy to marry this sort of route to code, single endpoint, minimal configuration type of approach with some of the features that folks might need, like the model binding and OpenAPI and Swagger. So I'm really excited to see what Steve's going to show us.
Yeah, same here. I mean, you raise a good point. There are situations in the real world where really all I want is route to code. Creating a controller, as Steve would say, really does feel like a dinosaur. It feels like a whole lot of ceremony for not much payoff. So with that, why don't we roll into the meat of the show, the hallway track, and let's hear from Steve and see what we can learn today.
Sure.
All right, welcome to the hallway track. So Steve, I know we were going to talk about controllers are dinosaurs. I believe there's a NuGet package you created that kind of supports this argument that you're making. What do you have to share with us today?
Sure. So I wanted to talk about a package I've got called API Endpoints. And as background for this, you'll find it on GitHub. There it is on the screen. You go to /Ardalis/API Endpoints, search for Ardalis on NuGet. You'll find it there as well. But in terms of background, this is basically taking the same approach that Microsoft took with Razor Pages and applying it to ASP.NET's approach to web APIs. So if you haven't used Razor Pages, let me just tell you why I'm a fan of those for a brief moment. When you use MVC with views, right, you end up having a controller with action methods for every different view that you're going to support. And then somewhere you've got models probably, because you're going to have strongly typed views that have these view models that you'll bind to them. And then somewhere you've got a views folder. And this is actually an important thing because MVC relies on that views folder to find the views. And then you have to have subfolders for the controller name. And then in there, finally, you've got the views. And so the result is that you have this mess of just files all over your Solution Explorer. And because controllers usually go in a controllers folder, it starts with letter C, and views are in that views folder, starts with V. They're nowhere near each other vertically inside your Solution Explorer. So you end up scrolling all over the place to find these things. Enter Razor Pages, in which Microsoft cleaned all this stuff up in .NET Core 2.0, and they made it so that you would have your view, its associated actions or behavior, all in one place with a code behind relationship that sounds a little bit like what Web Forms uses for code behind, but is not at all the same. And so still, in fact, retains all of the testability and maintainability that we have grown to love in MVC and in .NET Core. So with that, what I wanted to do is basically apply the same thing to our APIs, where in ASP.NET Core, if you're doing standard MVC development of APIs, it's not at all unusual to have controllers with many, many different action methods on them. And then separately from those, you might have another folder for DTOs or API models or whatever you want to call them. And again, you're ending up bouncing back and forth between your controllers that have the logic and your DTOs that have the wire protocol, if you will, that's sent over the wire. And then, of course, you've also got your domain model somewhere, your services somewhere that are actually doing the real work of the system. And so what API Endpoints does is it takes each individual action and makes it its own endpoint, if you will, that you're going to communicate with as its own file. And then the DTOs that go with that, the requests and the responses, are attached to that using a simple convention that Visual Studio supports. So I didn't have to do any work for that. So if we scroll down here a little bit and we look at what this looks like in your Solution Explorer with this little animated GIF, you can see here's the author endpoints folder, and each one of those CS files is an endpoint, and we'll look at that code in just a second. But then inside of Solution Explorer, the associated request and response types aren't in some other folder you have to go hunt down. You can just expand the tree next to the create endpoint like you see now, and those DTOs are right there with that endpoint. So when you're working on one endpoint, which typically is how you work, right? You don't typically work on 3 endpoints at the same time. You can focus on just that one class with just that one handler and just the 2 DTOs that you need to work with. And that's pretty much the idea for this.
So, one thing so I'll call out first, I know I can trust Steve after hearing his pronunciation of GIF. That is the correct way to say it.
I've gone back and forth, but I felt like GIF in that moment.
So, on a more serious note, it looks like the things that belong together are sort of logically, they exist by each other. You had pointed out the DTOs kind of live right there with the action. Is that the correct way to look at this?
That's my opinionated way to look at this. Yes.
Okay. So if you could talk through that decision, you had said that's an opinion. What is it that made you arrive at that organizational decision? What's the benefit?
Well, when you're working with an individual endpoint for an API like this one on the screen, this is everything you need for one endpoint. In this case, it's to update a model for an author data type. And it's a little bit longer even than it needs to be because I have a bunch of Swagger metadata that's in here as well that you wouldn't necessarily have all the time, or you wouldn't necessarily put it on 5 lines of code. But even at this relatively large font, this is it. This is everything. And so my chief motivation is make it so that individual API endpoints are small enough that you can fit them on one screen. And that the whole thing is there, right? So this is the class. It's telling you what the models are that it's working with, the update command and the updated result that you get back. It has all of its dependencies right with it. So you don't have to go and look at the controller and have a controller that has 6 or 8 or 20 different action methods on it. And you go see the constructor and it has 10 different dependencies being injected into it. And you have no idea which ones of those you actually care about for the endpoint you're working with. Here, every one of these things being injected into this class are used by this method because there's only one method, right? This is it. So there's just one handle method that does all the work here.
So would you say that this is more for like maintainability and like organization purposes, or are there other advantages of organizing this, like of using that kind of structure?
It's all about maintainability. It's all about being able to work productively on the code, not be distracted by other things, not have your files get big and bloated and out of control. Yep.
Okay.
So we do have a question right off the bat here that we'll ask Steve. I'll put it up on the screen. The question is around gRPC and how this idea could be extended to that instead of a web API, let's say a gRPC service.
Sure. That's a very good question. I haven't tried it. So I suspect someone that takes a look at this project and how I implemented it might be able to do something very similar for gRPC, or it might be something I'll take a look at because I just hadn't thought of it before. I've been using web APIs a lot more than I've been using gRPC. So it's a great idea, and it's definitely something we could try.
Well, we also have a comment here that this looks sort of like something from Uncle Bob, a screaming architecture.
Sure. And what my opinion of what he's referring to is that this, the architecture should tell you what it's all about and not get organized based on the structures you're using in your code, like controllers and views and things like that. And so probably they're talking about the fact that I have author right in the root of the app here. And of course, you can organize these however you want. So if you want to call this a feature, or you want to call this a user story, or whatever you like, the endpoints basically sit at the same level as controllers and controller actions. So you're free to organize them however you want. But it does mean typically you don't need as many subfolders for pattern named things. Like there's no controllers folder, there's no views folder, there's no view models folder, API models folder. So from that perspective, it does help organizationally, I think.
Sure. So something that caught my attention right off the bat here was it was actually line 11. So it looks like you're deriving from a base async endpoint class. Is this part of your API endpoints library?
It is. Yep. So you have to have the Ardalis endpoints NuGet package. And so if we look at the dependencies here under, it's a project dependency in this case because it's part of my sample, but you would get it as a NuGet package to bring it in. Now, one of the questions that everybody should be wondering and asking about this, and maybe no one's asked it directly in the chat yet, is, well, this is great, Steve, but you just reinvented all of the controller features. How does this work? Is it supported? Does routing work? Does security work? Am I going to be able to use my filters? What about all the attributes that I have in my system? And so the interesting thing about this is that there's almost no code because if we go look at this base async endpoint, I'm just inheriting from controller. And so if we look down here at this base endpoint, it's just inheriting from controller base. So it is a controller. And all I've done is decorate that controller with a little bit of this fancy stuff here that lets you specify the request and response. And I have the community to thank for this, actually, because my original version of this only offered a couple of different options using generics and saying it was a generic API endpoint of this request and this response. And that worked fine as long as you always had both. But sometimes you might have something that doesn't have any request with it, right? I just want to get a list of things. So I don't pass any parameters. I just get back a result. And so I also had one that was an endpoint of response, but didn't take a request. Well, with generics, if you do that, you're now stuck with, your single types generic thing has to be whatever I made it, in this case, response. There's also a case to be made for endpoints that only have a request, but don't have a particular response. Like when you do a delete and you're not expecting anything back, but maybe a 204, no content, I don't need to create a response DTO for that. But my original approach didn't support that. So the community was nice and recently just gave me this PR that uses this fluent generic approach. So now you can specify with request or response or not as you wish on any of these. So like on get, I think. Get says, with request, this one's got one, with request int, and with response author, but you can change this up to be whatever you want. So you can say without request, and you can even say without response, right? So you can do whatever type of generic endpoints there you want, which is really slick. But the main point here that I wanted to make is all of this stuff is really just this. It's an API controller that inherits from controller base. So it is ASP.NET Core MVC. Everything you get from ASP.NET Core MVC controllers, you still get. This just lets you organize your code in a different, and what I would argue is a little better fashion.
There was another question here in chat, and this caught my attention right away, but I didn't want to redirect the conversation. Since the question came up, I'll pop it up on the screen. This refers to your update CS file that you have open over there. So the class declaration up on the line where you're deriving from that base class. The viewer here is wondering, hey, what's up with lines 12 and 13 there?
Right. I think that's what I just showed. So that's what I'm calling a fluent generic approach. So what this is doing is this is setting generic endpoint arguments on here. So when we go look at the code here, these are different classes that I could inherit from. And I'm specifying which class I'm inheriting from using that fluent interface. So they all ultimately inherit from base endpoint async. But they're going to have a generic, with response or not, if they say without. And they're also going to have a generic with request here, with request or not. And so what these let you do, this combination, there's basically 4 options, right? You either have a request or you don't, you have a response or you don't. And so these static classes let you organize this to give you this fluent looking interface where at the end of the day, you're specifying which one of these you're actually inheriting from. So if you're going to have both, which is probably the most typical case, you end up here, which is where you've got a request of T request and a response of T response, and that will generate this handle async that returns back a response and takes in a request. But based on which one of these static classes you use, you'll end up with a different signature in here.
Really cool.
This looks great. So, now that I'm looking at this, I definitely see the value. My question would be, if I wanted to migrate from a Dinosaur controller to the library that you have here, is there any kind of a migration guide that you provide? Or maybe it's not even needed because it's just that straightforward.
Yeah, if I wanted to convert something, I don't have a guide at the moment, but it would be just a matter of taking, let's go look at this create endpoint. I would go find an action method in a controller that already exists, right? And so this would be the post to create a new record of that type, right? And so I would just grab the attributes and the method itself, and I would pull it into an endpoint, and then I would take the DTOs that it was using and use those to specify the request and the response. And then once I had that, I still wouldn't have the constructor arguments, right? But in here, everything that I didn't have as a dependency would be lit up. And so I would know which ones I need. I would say, okay, well, I don't have the mapper and I don't have the repository. So let me go grab those from the constructor and just copy paste them into here, and you're done. Right now, you've moved it over. The only thing you would have to do is maybe double check that your route works now, because you may not be inheriting from the same base class, so you may not be inheriting all the same route parameters. But once you sort that out and you make sure the route is the route that you expect, and it should be the same route you were using before, right? Because you don't want to change anything externally. That would be it, right? So now your existing controller still is there. So it might have a dozen action methods or whatever. Well, now it only has 11. And next to it, somewhere else in your solution, you've got this endpoint, perhaps starting a new endpoints folder. And you can do it just one action method at a time. And it's pretty easy to do without breaking anything.
So what I'm hearing then is this library, this approach can happily coexist with traditional controllers or dinosaurs, whatever we want to call them now, in that there's no risk there. The two can happily live in the same application.
Yep, exactly.
And Ken was demanding his money back because you're still using controllers.
No, the controllers are still there, but they're not being used to organize the code anymore, right? They're just being used for the MVC features.
We do have a question here from Wijan Ruiz asking, if basics and endpoints inherits from API controller, does authorization work like an API controller?
It works exactly the same. Yep. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to, you could come up here and you could add another endpoint here, right? So I could say like HTTP get, whack foo or whatever. And this will show up as another action, right? So public action result foo. But there is also a, this needs to return. We'll say, okay. All right, there's what's it called? A code analyzer that if you install this as well, it should tell you when you're doing that, so that you don't accidentally add those things. But I mean, you shouldn't do that anyway. Obviously, I've lost which one it was that I had. I guess it was on create. But if you do this, it'll work, because at the end of the day, it really is just inheriting from a controller. But it's really just breaking all of the reasons why you would even bother using endpoints.
Got it. We have a viewer here asking if you can sort of run this code and step through it so they see the life cycle of what's going on with that HTTP request.
Yeah, definitely. So it works with Swagger, obviously, and you can saw I've got some of the Swagger metadata in there, so that's where that's showing up here. If we want to get a list of authors, we can try this out and say we'll have page 0 of 5 per page, execute, and hopefully this works. And look, there's me and Julie Lerman, who wrote the DDD fundamentals course with me. So that's working. Now they requested actually stepping through it. So let me, let's just do a create, and we'll put a breakpoint in here somewhere right here, and launch the debugger. And it's going to be pretty, I don't know, not exciting, because it's just going to pop into that breakpoint, but it's pretty straightforward. At least it will be if the debugger runs. What did it just do? It just stopped. There we go.
I swear we weren't setting you up for failure here,
Yeah.
Steve.
No, it works the second time. Okay, so here we are. Theoretically, the debugger's running. Let's go into the post, and we'll try it out. And we'll add a new Scott Addy. I don't know if you're on Pluralsight, are you?
No,
What are you? Scott.
just another Scott.
All right, so there, that worked, but didn't work, actually. Hit a 400. Oh, Pluralsight is required. Hey, look at that. I meant to do that. Look, model validation works, and you get all this stuff like you would expect. So do that. And now we hit the breakpoint, right? So model validation prevented us from actually coming in here because we're inheriting from API controller. That all happens before it even gets into your action method. But now we're in here. We can look at this command, this request, and pop this open. You can see Scott Addy, Pluralsight URL, Twitter alias. That's all good. We can step, create the thing, map, and then we've got now a result type, which is a different type. And it's, in this case, it's got basically the same things, but this one's added an ID, right? So the request didn't include an ID because the ID is going to be set by the database, but the response needs to pass back the ID so that the client knows what the ID is to use in future requests. But that's pretty much it, right? So then we're done, and we step out of here, and it's just going to hit the getters on the command, and that's it. So it created it, and there it is.
Wonderful. So looking through the chat history here, we do have another question. I don't think this one was asked yet. If it was, forgive me. But what are the benefits over configuring the endpoints directly with the .configure method and use endpoints?
Sure. So if you come into startup.cs, again, this is just the sample that ships with the thing. You would do your own, whatever organization you want. Let me stop the debugger and get my windows back. So down here, we could say .configure and specify an endpoint. All I have to do is say map controllers, right? And this works just the way it would, because at the end of the day, it's using controllers. So I would say the benefit is you're not having to go into the configure method in startup and touch that to mess with anything. I really like routes that are configured in attributes, the attribute-based routing. I like being able to look at the endpoint itself and know what its route is, so that when something's not working, I know that like this is where I need to look, and not have to go digging around in startup.cs. And this is, at the end of the day, for me at least, I like the pattern of I've got a request, I've got an endpoint, and I've got a response, and they're all right here, right? They're all associated with that method that we're looking at. So even in the README file for the repository, I don't know if it'll get any traction at all, but I've coined the Reaper pattern name for request endpoint response to reflect that, right? So instead of thinking about a model and a view and a controller, well, we don't even have views in APIs, right? You could argue that the response is the view, but it's not what you would traditionally consider a view in a UI-based system. What you have is a request, an endpoint, and a response, and that's all you have to deal with.
All right, and the questions just keep on rolling here. This is awesome.
We have one from David Pine. Our co-hosts, when they're not on the show, they are on the audience. They don't take a break. So now I'm curious if this might be an opportunity for source generated. It still seems like boilerplate, the real logics in each core method. So any thoughts on that?
Certainly this stuff could be cleaned up a little bit. And it doesn't have to be that long, and there's a little bit of duplication in here. Like I probably don't even need to set both of these things. So if that part seems overly verbose, I totally get that, and you could get rid of that. If you're using the conventions for your routes, one of the things that you can't easily do here is use the handy controller convention that you might be familiar with, especially if you use a base API class. That doesn't really work with endpoints because the class name, the controller name on here is just get, and you'll probably have a lot of those if you have multiple different folders full of endpoints. And so you're better off here to use the actual type and be specific about it in this case. That's not a lot of extra code to have to write, in my opinion. I don't know how you would use code generators for this part, right? You're still going to need the constructor to have whatever dependencies, and those are going to be unique to each endpoint, which I think is a good thing. If you didn't want to have this, though, the other thing you can certainly still do, and I think is a little nice in this place, is that you can take all your dependencies and throw them into this handle method. Now, you were always able to do that in your controller anyway. You could always do method-based injection by specifying your dependencies as parameters to the action method. But if you do that using endpoints, then you get rid of all this code and the whole thing gets even shorter, right? You'll just have 2 lines of code here with the injection, because these things that you're injecting into the class, they're not being used by anything except for one method. So there's not much need for them to be class level fields. And I don't have an example of that off the top of my head, and I don't remember the syntax off the top of my head because I never use it. But Scott, or one of you, what's the syntax if I want to pass a dependency in here? Do you know offhand?
I don't.
From
Is it
services.
inject or from services? That sounds right.
So
from services, and let's just say I want that mapper. I can say imapper mapper.
Yeah,
right,
so
I
we
can
should
do that.
we should talk about that. So from services, a lot of people haven't seen this, at least from what I've observed in the wild. This is sort of an alternative to constructor injection. In this case, only this method needs that parameter. So we're injecting it in this way using the from services attribute.
And that's just hit a problem, which is that my handle async method doesn't actually support that. So maybe that doesn't work. Isn't there an attribute-based one that does it? Maybe there's not.
It's possible. I can't think of what it would be off the top of my head.
All right. Well, we're trying things on the fly, and it's not exactly working. But I thought I'd seen that like a year ago. Someone had made that work with an endpoint, but obviously it's not something I've done a lot of. But I think there's a way we can make that work. Maybe I just need like a params arguments at the end or something that would let you do it. So then you could pass in dependencies as a params array at the end, maybe. But that's only if you thought this was too verbose. And I don't really think it is. Like most people that are used to dependency injection are going to expect to see those dependencies in the constructor. And so I think this is probably the typical way you would do it. And yeah, we could probably make this a little bit smaller, but I think it's small enough as it is. So certainly compared to a lot of controllers I see. I work with a lot of clients that have a lot of legacy code, and they have controllers with hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 lines of code in them. And this would help that, right? This makes it much easier for you to focus on one API endpoint that you're working on.
Yep. Yeah, I'm seeing all kinds of comments in the chat about from services. So from services is documented, believe it or not. If you were to look through our dependency injection docs in I believe it's the ASP.NET Core doc set, you'll find it documented out there. There was another question.
I think I wrote those docs originally back in the 1.0 days.
Yep.
But I haven't used it since
And
then.
I think they were trying to help us, but because there is a delay as well.
Yeah, so Steve has done a fair amount of work for us, both in the docs and in the ebooks. So you can believe everything he is telling you, is I guess what I'm trying to say. We do
I'm
have
always
another,
learning.
Memory's not perfect.
Yeah, we do have another question in the chat. I knew this would come up, and it's focused on the acronym that I can never pronounce, but it's hypermedia as the engine of application state. And the question is, does this work nicely with that acronym I can't pronounce? I have controllers that use reflection to automatically build links, etc.
Right. You can't pronounce HADIOAS. That's I don't know how he's doing it in particular, or they're doing it in particular. So I don't know the reflection approach they're using. I agree with them. If they're using reflection, just look for other methods on the same controller. That might be difficult. If instead of reflection, if they use the route table or some other way of determining how to build their routes, maybe it would work just fine at that point. There's nothing that would prevent you, right? Your hypermedia is basically generating links that look like this. There's great support for link generation in the routing middleware in ASP.NET Core that you can leverage, or it's not that hard for you to build your own if you know what these are, right? If you're using the same structure over and over again, and you're mostly doing, let's say, CRUD operations with whatever your hierarchy of types is, instead of using reflection, you might be able to just model that yourself in such a way that you would easily be able to create these, based on that. So I'm assuming that, again, without seeing your code, I'm assuming you've got a bunch of things that are like, hey, I just created this record. Generate me a link for the get details of that record. Generate me a link for how to update that record. Well, that would be trivial to do if you knew that the record was going to be under the same route prefix for the type of thing it is / whatever's, and then after that it's either going to be this ID method, or you're going to do a put, let's say, to do an update, in which case it's going to look a lot like this one. In that case, and maybe you want to add the ID to the route or not. Personally, I don't like to do that with updates, because then you end up with usually the ID is in the request and in the route, and your code has to pick which one wins. And I don't like having ambiguous code, so I just put it inside the request and keep it out of the route.
Yep,
So-
I agree with you there. Go ahead, Luis.
No, that's actually what I was going to bring up. We have related or similar comments here. One's from Jason Diaz, asking that they use controllers, and how does versioning work with these methods? And I believe I had it here somewhere. Somebody else mentioned that they assume that it works the same way with endpoints, the versioning.
Right. It should work the same way. It depends on how you're doing it, right? There's a whole lot of ways to slice the way you want to do versioning. So you could be doing that with some kind of HTTP headers. A lot of people use routes for that, and so you might have something like a WAC API, WAC V1, WAC authors, or something like that. That's not that unusual. If you want to be able to version all of the endpoints at once, probably you'd want to use a constant or something in here that you could then just update in one place. This gives you the flexibility to be able to version individual endpoints independently, but you probably don't want or need that flexibility, I'm guessing. So if I were you, since these are probably going to be magic strings in here, it'll be good in a real system. Again, this is just a sample. In a real system, you'd probably want to do something to manage these magic strings using constants or something like that, which you could then store in the root of the endpoints folder or in somewhere else in your app, as one approach for that. And even these things could be, like this is /authors. If I wanted this sample to be a little bit cleaner, I could easily go in here and do something like this. Could I? Maybe I can't. No, I didn't name this thing authors. I'd have to figure out the name of the namespace. Okay, not so easily. But I could get rid of these magic strings by using constants for sure. So that's the way it was. All right. I keep trying things on the fly, and they're not quite working as well as I would like. So, but that's streaming on Twitch for you without a script.
Yeah, like I said in the beginning, unscripted. You should expect things like this, because that's how it works in the real world. That's what people like to see.
So Ryan Reynolds is not on stream today, but it seems like somebody believes we have another actor on stream.
Nice. Just saw that in chat. So I see a couple of comments in the chat around testing. I don't know if you have it looks like you might have a testing project in this solution.
Yep.
How would you go about testing something like this? I guess, how does that differ from testing an action in a traditional controller?
If you have end-to-end functional integration tests, whatever you want to call them, using this iClass fixture and custom web application factory approach that ASP.NET Core supported for a while now, you can easily write these types of tests for your controller-based actions. And they will work exactly the same for API endpoints. So if you have this suite of tests that says, hey, I expect that, when I create an endpoint, it creates a new author, and, given some long-running request, it'll cancel the request, right? You can see all these things pass. Let's run them again just to make sure I didn't break anything while we're talking. The really cool thing is if you already have those tests, which you absolutely should, because they're really easy to write and they run quickly. So I write these for any of my APIs that I do. When you refactor to use API endpoints and give you that cleaner organization of those files, all these tests should still run and behave exactly the same. That's how you know you refactored it correctly, is if your tests still run and everything works the same as it did. So definitely this is how I would write those tests. To answer that question is I would use the custom web application factory and write methods that look like this, and you're welcome to go steal this code from the GitHub repo. It's also in the eShop on Web sample. It's also in my clean architecture template. And there's good docs on integration testing ASP.NET Core that will show you how to do all this as well.
Awesome. So, kind of taking a step back from getting out of the weeds here, where have you used this in the real world? Have you implemented this with any clients that you've worked with, and what are some benefits that they've realized?
I'm using it by default for all my new stuff, and I am recommending it to clients, and I know of a number of clients that are working with it. It's in the eShop on Web sample as just an option. So the eShop on Web is kind of meant to show a variety of different ways of doing things. So it shows endpoints, it also shows controllers, it shows Razor pages, it also shows views, and so you'll see different ways of doing things in that sample. I do have clients that are using this. I don't have their permission to tell you who that is right now, but it is, being used by clients. I think GitHub shows like somewhere like how many people are using a thing over here on the right somewhere, and it's got 292 different public repos are using it, so it's not nothing. It doesn't have a ton of downloads yet on NuGet. It's only 83,000, which is not huge, but it's being used by some people, and it works really well. I mean, there's not much to it. It's literally a tiny veneer over base controller, and it just lets you organize your code in a nicer way. And I should point out one other thing about that. I just remembered. Some people may wonder, like, what fancy thing or plugin or extension am I using to make it so this works, right? And this is just a built-in Visual Studio thing where if you name this other file and you prefix the name of its parent on it, then Visual Studio automatically chains these files together for you. So I didn't have to do any work to make that work. I just had to use that convention. And when I create that DTO that goes with the list endpoint, I just make sure I prefix it with list dot and then the name of the DTO.
Yeah, and as Curious Drive points out in the chat, 83,000 downloads is, not nothing.
Yeah, it's not bad, but
It was like if I had a project with a personal project with $83,000, I would be pretty happy. So.
And I was just thinking, I don't know if I've had 83,000 people read my docs.
Oh, I'm sure we did.
It's pretty impressive. What you were just pointing out with the nesting, I do know there's a way to customize nesting behavior in Visual Studio. I just can't remember how off the top of my head.
Yeah, you can customize it and do your own different things as well. But if you don't change anything and you want this to just work for anyone that pulls in your project, this is the default behaviors if you follow this convention. So it's nice if you use the defaults, nobody has to customize anything.
Of course, but keep in mind that falls apart in VS Code if you use that. But that's a different problem entirely.
Yeah, the experience in VS Code is not terrible either, though, because let me just show that real quick. If we open this in File Explorer and I'll launch it in VS Code, you don't get the same nesting, it's true, but here's the sample. Here's my author endpoints, right? But you see all the create stuff is together. So they're at least sorted in the proper order where they're grouped together, even in VS Code. So you don't have to go hunting around and find some other folder where these things might live. So they're not chained, they're not expandable like a tree view, but they do at least sort nicely when you follow that convention.
And just to clarify, this is based on the directory, right? So for example, if you had to create somewhere else in another subdirectory, it would still list it under that. It would sort of do code behind for that specific create in that other subdirectory.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So if I have authors, let's say authors write books, right? Well, I could come over here and I could rename this and call it book endpoints. If I could use my mouse. And for now, none of the namespaces got updated, right? So this isn't going to build, but this would still work the same. I would just go through and all these author things I would change to book, and they would sit side by side like that.
Sweet.
And I mean, the biggest realization for me was when I was looking at Razor pages and seeing how that let me focus on one particular page and all the things I needed to work with that page in one place. That was huge. Like it's death by 1,000 paper cuts when you're trying to scroll around and find all the pieces you need in a typical MVC project. And it only gets worse the bigger it gets. So as a big enterprise with large projects that have many different types and many different controllers, it gets significantly painful. It just stops being fun working with the code because of all that friction. And so this just basically took the same thing and said, let's just do that for APIs. because I don't write a lot of view-based actions anymore. Everything is APIs these days, for me at least, because everything is a Blazor front end or Angular or React, and we're talking to the server primarily through API calls. So being able to organize everything I need for one endpoint in one place makes my life a lot easier, because I don't care about all the other stuff that's not that one endpoint I'm looking at right now.
Sure. So, something that's made me think of, there's that themes of .NET website, which I'm sure you've seen. One of the focal points for the upcoming .NET 6 release will be simplification of web APIs and sort of dumbing down that API surface. I wonder, have you put any thought into what that means for your API endpoints library? Will it still serve a purpose, or sort of?
I haven't seen. I know they just released a preview, but I haven't had a chance to play with it yet. I don't know what using APIs in 6 is going to look like, so I can't say yet whether this project stops having a reason to exist. If Microsoft just makes it super easy to do APIs in such a way that I don't have to bounce all over the solution file to find all the different files that I need to do the work, then I'll be happy, right? That'll be great. And if this thing just becomes a blip that goes away after a couple of years because somebody needs it, that's fine. That means the product's getting better, and I'm definitely a fan of that. I did talk to Microsoft about this idea a few months before I published it. So like last year, before the pandemic, when we could actually travel, I was at NDC London, and I talked to some members of the .NET team, and we had a good discussion about it. But it didn't seem like something that they were keen to do. It just wasn't on their priority list, which is what led to me, creating this library myself. But if .NET 6 is the right time when they're going to address this, then that'll be awesome.
Yeah, I think in .NET 6 we're going to see some movement here. There was the Feather HTTP experiment that David Fowler was working on. That was back in the 5.0 wave, I want to say. But that kind of sparked some ideas, and then I'm sure the conversation you had at NDC sort of helped push that forward. But, so in the 5.0 release, microservices was a huge theme. Web API plays a small part in that, of course. And, so again, in 6.0, we will see some refining in that area. What that looks like, I really don't know at this point. Still early days.
And I could potentially see, right, with C#9 and some of those top level statements and those changes to the language itself, making it just even easier, right, to have as low ceremony as possible to write these endpoints.
Yeah, I think that's the goal. Some of the things I've seen, experiments and things, often end up with you writing little functions in here, similar to what you started today's stream with showing. And I personally, I like functions as much as the next software developer, but I really like having classes that I can work with independently and I can apply certain principles to, like solid, that, this class just has this one responsibility and it's only doing this one thing. And at the end of the day, it really only has one function. But the benefit to me of having a class is that it has a name. It has, easy to find in my navigation. I can see all of its dependencies in a known way through constructor injection. I can, mark it up with attributes very easily on both the class if I want and the method. So I am not going to necessarily be super thrilled if the default way that they want to make really small endpoints is going to be go write a whole bunch of little, Lambda functions inside your configure method. So I hope that that's not the case, because you can do that today. It's just not it's not as nice of an experience as using MVC is, in my opinion. Yeah, I just saw somebody posted the expected plans for that.
Yep. So there is a GitHub issue. I found it. This is what I was referring to. If you're curious, what the team plans to do with Web API to, make it more approachable and hopefully incorporate some of Steve's ideas, check out that GitHub issue. So I guess my next question would be, so what does the roadmap look like for this project? Or maybe there isn't a roadmap. Are there any features you plan to add that aren't there yet?
There's issues that come up from time to time that people suggest, and I don't think I've fixed all of them, but there's not a crazy amount of them. There's 11 of them here, and so there's a few different things. I think the code analyzers I'm not sure if those are still working because I just tried them in the stream and it didn't look like it was working the way it was supposed to. So those probably need updated. And there's a few other questions and things here. Yeah, here's the verify fixed code analyzers one. So that's not working yet. But overall, it's close to done in terms of it just works. It provides this facade over controller, and there's only a few things here that folks have requested. So if you have a question, you the audience watching this, feel free to post a question in the issues if you like, or if you have a suggestion for something that you're not seeing working. That question about hypermedia as the engine of application state, that could certainly go in here and maybe provide some examples of what you're using, and we could see how we could support that using this pattern.
Now, I'm sure that this is one of many projects that you sort of got going on. So do you welcome contributions, and how can folks contribute back to the project?
Yeah, I try and mark things as good first issue, help wanted, etc., which you can see I have on one of these. And yeah, if you want to have a just post an issue, and if you want to help on an issue, just post a comment. If you're wanting to do this one or any of them, right? Just post a comment and say, hey, I'd like to work on this, and then I'll just assign it to you, or just let you work on it. And any contribution would be great. So while I'm in here and I'm thinking of it, let me give credit to the right person, because this Fluent Generics thing was Paul Van Blottel. Was the one that did the PR, and he got the idea from whoever this is. Tears Me. This blog post had it. So if you want to learn more about how that Fluent Generic stuff works, which is pretty cool how that works, and lets you dynamically choose a multi-generic base class for your class, that's where this idea came from.
Awesome. So we're coming up on the 5-minute mark of the show. So this is typically the time where we let you, share any resources or leave us with some closing thoughts, or maybe next steps to get started with your library here. Is there anything you wanted to share?
Well, easily the best place to go is just go to github.com API Endpoints, or just jump out to NuGet and search for that. I do have a bunch of other open source free NuGet packages out here. By far the most popular one is this Ardalis guard clauses, which is probably the reason why I don't think the 80 some K was all that huge a download number. So that one's used by tons of people just to clean up their code, along with Smart Enum, and specification is another one that I've been spending a lot of time working on lately. So if you're not familiar with specification, what it lets you do is take all that Lambda gunk that you've got in your controllers and services that's representing all your link queries for Entity Framework. And you can put those inside of individual classes, give them names, test them, and reuse them as separate specifications. And then when you go to make your queries, you just say, with this specification, you pass it in, and your query runs just the way it did before. But now you don't have all that stuff inside your other layers of your code. You can just encapsulate that in your domain model. So that'd be a good one to check out. In terms of, blatant self-promotion, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm Ardalis there, as most places. If you go find me on Pluralsight, if you have a Pluralsight subscription, or you can get an access, you'll find there's lots of stuff that I have there as well. I think the search for Ardalis will find you there as well. And that's about it. That's all I've got.
And it sounded like you and Julie Lerman were working on some updates to a Pluralsight course. Which one was that?
We are working on the DDD course, DDD Fundamentals. So you could go check that out. It's there's an existing one from 2014 called DDD Fundamentals, and then this new refresh is basically a facelift on that. It's using the new branding. It'll actually be at a higher resolution, so the newer courses are going to be at 1080 instead of 720. And the samples are all .NET 5. So if folks want to see a preview of those samples, they're on GitHub now. GitHub.com. I don't see where it is, but I'll find it for you. Repositories. I've got a couple repositories on GitHub, so there's like 200 of them. But this Pluralsight DDD Fundamentals course is the one. So you can go check that out. At this moment, right this second, it's not working. So fair warning, but I'll get it fixed up here in another day or so.
And much love to Julie.
Yep.
Thanks.
Another great community member.
I see here a comment from Todd Bull that you should have a Twitch to do sessions on there. I believe you are on Twitch as well. Is that correct, Steve?
Yeah, I am. I'm Ardalis on Twitch, as most places. I stream on Fridays when I have time. So it used to be pretty regularly, but now it's sort of like hit or miss. I think the time I'm aiming for now is like 3 to 5 in the afternoon on Fridays, Eastern time. Somebody's commenting on the avatar. That was from Star Trek conference. So Star Trek, I can plug Star Trek too while I'm here. Star Trek is an Ohio conference I've been a part of for years. And one of the benefits they do for speakers is these cool comic book avatars that a lot of folks then keep. And so like this one, but also this one. And so this is the event we're doing this year. Because of COVID, we're not going to have our usual 2,500 member conference in a movie theater in Ohio, but it's online, so anyone can join. So if you go to StarTrek.com, our registration just opened about a week ago, and it'll be on May 7th. So it's a 1-day, 1-track event. You can see the sessions on there, and it's all free. So we're going to try and have another real in-person event in the fall if conditions allow and vaccinations keep going well. But for the spring, we didn't want to miss another year. We had to cancel our event last spring. And so we're trying to do something just to kind of keep things going.
And someone named what actor you look like. They said that you have Alec Baldwin's eyes, and I agree. You kind of have a.
I do hear from time to time people think I look like Alec Baldwin. So I mean, there's worse problems to have, I guess.
So note to self, when we post this up on the YouTubes, we'll put Alec Baldwin and not Steve Smith. Viewership will go through the roof.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you to Steve. Steve, again, just hang out for a little bit afterwards and we'll wrap things up with you. I did want to point out that for next week's show, we'll be talking about deploying a Blazor WebAssembly app to GitHub pages. So if that's something that interests you, tune in at the regular time next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
See ya.